Okay, so this is our Civil Liberties Project, Rights of the Accused, by myself, Jasmine Alvarenga, Carol Yin, and Sergio Rojas. A little bit of food for thought. Land of the free and home of the brave is the ideology of our country, but was it always this way? So before the Bill of Rights, when the Constitution was implemented, it failed to specifically identify the individual freedoms that each citizen had. This created problems because citizens were getting their rights trampled. Colonists were getting their homes searched and invaded with no protection from the government and getting in trouble for having anti British evidence. This led to the Bill of Rights, which includes rights for the accused. The Supreme Court acknowledges that the accused American has a right to due process and protection. The Bill of Rights protects the American through a few constitutional provisions, one of them being unreasonable search and seizures, specifically the Warrant Clause from the Fourth Amendment, self incrimination, that's in the Fifth Amendment, and having the right to an attorney, specifically through the Assistance of Counsel Clause that's found in the Sixth Amendment. Let's dive deeper into them. The Fourth Amendment states in the Warrant Clause, no warrants shall issue except upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things being seized. Although this made the job harder for police, the Supreme Court said that privacy of citizens and their constitutional rights took priority. So what this meant is that officers now needed a warrant signed by the judge to obtain any evidence. The Fourth Amendment applies to the states by the way of due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Self-incrimination. Fifth Amendment states, no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. This means that someone accused cannot be forced to say anything incriminating against themselves. This was implemented to help protect individuals from a coerced confession. Now we have the right to an attorney, which is found in the Assistance of Counsel Clause through the Sixth Amendment. It states that people shall enjoy the right to have assistance of counsel for his defense, meaning that if they cannot afford the right to an attorney, it is the burden of the government to provide one at no cost to them. So some of the landmark rulings that apply to these constitutional provisions are Miranda versus Arizona, Riley versus California, Mapp versus Ohio, and Gideon versus Wainwright. Let's talk about them further. In Riley versus California, David Riley was a known gang member and he was justifiably pulled over. During that time, he had 2 handguns in his possession, and so the police officers arrested him. They found incriminating evidence on his phone that helped convict him. Riley took this to the Supreme Court on grounds that his right of protection from unreasonable search and seizures had been violated. The Supreme Court agreed with him and overturned his conviction. They agreed that police needed a warrant to search this item. This case helps enforce the warrant clause from the Fourth Amendment that a warrant needs to be issued by a judge to be able to obtain certain items as evidence. In the case law of Mapp versus Ohio, that happened in 1961 in Cleveland, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that under the 4th and 14th constitutional amendments, illegally seized evidence could not be used in a state criminal trial. This significantly changed law enforcement procedures on a state level and led to the exclusionary rule, which means any evidence cannot be admissible in court. This protects individuals from unreasonable search and seizures. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, Ernesto Miranda was being questioned by police without an attorney present, and he confessed to a criminal offense. Later on, Miranda took this to the Supreme Court, and they ruled in his favor on the grounds that police had not informed him of his right to remain silent and to have legal assistance. Because of this case, it helps protect from self-incrimination and it set the tone of what officers need to take before interrogating a suspect, which is now known as the Miranda warning. In Gideon versus Wainwright, this was a monumental ruling because it held that criminal defendants must be provided a lawyer at government expense if they cannot afford one. Before the Supreme Court ruling, it only applied to criminals in federal cases through Johnson versus Zerbs, the case law. After the ruling, it made it mandatory for states to have adequate legal counsel or the right to an attorney. So some of the legislative and executive orders that apply are the 14th Amendment and immunity. The 14th Amendment that was adopted in July 9th, 1868, under Section 1 states, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It also mentions that nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. With the Fifth Amendment, it only applied to capital criminal cases, but this 14th Amendment extended it to the states. And now we have Sergio.
Hello, my name is Sergio Rojas, and I will be covering immunity. Immunity in layman's terms is if a defendant or witness comes in and to testify for immunity, the government will not use anything that the defendant says to prosecute them. There are two types of witness immunity, use immunity and transactional immunity. These began in 1789. Qualified immunity, this type of immunity is granted to state and local officials, and began in 1871. Use immunity. When use immunity is in play, then whatever the defendant says in their testimony, it will not be used against them. An example would be if a defendant states they were in some sort of illegal activity or state that they have harmed someone. Government cannot prosecute for such statements, but if they find evidence, then they will prosecute. Transactional immunity. Transactional immunity gives complete immunity. This means the government will not prosecute, and even with evidence, they will not pursue further. Prosecutors do not like using immunity for reasons of allowing a person that has done or is doing illegal activity off the hook. Could you play the video for me, Jasmine? Thank you. This is Ted Cruz's podcast. It's kind of showing how transitional immunity can be used, and just seeing from a congressman's side.
Biden just say, I don't want to answer your questions. I plead the fifth, and I'm not going to say anything. So he can, and if we call Hunter Biden, he will almost certainly plead the fifth. Now, here's the interesting thing. There's a federal statute that gives the Senate the authority to grant him what's called transactional immunity, which means we can force him to testify. Now, he can't be prosecuted for anything he testifies to, okay? But you can find out, you can get his testimony, and that's something the Senate can do, grant him immunity. And I got to say, that idea, you want to talk about—
You can pause it, Jasmine. And that's an example of transitional immunity. The next slide, please. Qualified immunity. Qualified immunity. This form of immunity is given to state and local officials. Under this, officials are granted immunity and cannot have civil suits placed against them. Only when officials violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights. Not everyone agrees to it, because it can be seen that officials are allowed to do whatever they like. Castigar versus United States. So in this case, the defendant had a refusal to testify at a grand jury hearing on Fifth Amendment grounds, despite there having been granted immunity. Immunity granted was not wide enough to prevent persecution of a defendant if testimony was given. Higher courts were involved, and then transitional immunity was given, therefore giving the defendant the protection that he needed. Conclusion. Without the implementation of these constitutional provisions, the Supreme Court landmark rulings, and the legislation that applied it to states, we would still have citizens' rights being trampled, especially those accused.
Thank you for watching our video.
Thank you.